You are crouched in the darkness of the forbidden city, hidden behind layers of embroidered silk curtains. The air is heavy with incense, yet beneath it, you catch another sound, a faint rasp, a silk ribbon being twisted tight around a man's throat. It is the winter of 1542. 16 palace women move like wraiths across the marble floor of Emperor Jiajing's bedchamber. Their bare feet leave no sound as they close in on the most powerful man in the world. One girl, barely 14, trembles as she pulls the curtain cord tighter around the sleeping emperor's neck. Her hands shake not from weakness, but from the knowledge that this moment means only two possible fates: freedom or a death too horrible to imagine. In the Imperial Harem, there is never a middle path. But the knot slips. The ribbon catches awkwardly. The emperor stirs, choking, half awake. A lifetime of planning collapses in an instant. Soon, these women will be dragged away, condemned to execution so excruciating that even their families will not escape punishment. Yet in this moment, this fragile heartbeat of rebellion, they dared to do the unthinkable. They dared to fight back. Most who visit the Forbidden City today see only majesty. They marvel at red lacquered walls and golden roofs that glimmer like fire under the Beijing Sunday. They photograph grand halls named after harmony and longevity. But hidden within those same walls are stories of women who were silenced, women who walked through the vermilion gates never to return, women whose entire lives became sacrifices to an emperor's desire or superstition. For every chamber admired by tourists, there are thousands of unheard voices buried beneath its foundations. For more than 2,000 years, from the Qin dynasty around 200 BCE through the fall of the Qing in 1912, Chinese emperors presided over vast harems. At their height, these harems held not dozens, but tens of thousands of women, a population larger than some cities. In the Ming dynasty alone, the number could reach 20,000. The hierarchy inside was as precise as it was merciless, stretching from the all-powerful empress down to nameless servants whose lives were considered worth less than the silk they carried. And how did these women enter this world? Not by choice. Every 3 years, officials swept across the empire in search of young girls between 14 and 16. Families, regardless of wealth or rank, were compelled to present their daughters for inspection. Appearance mattered, but not as much as bloodline, virtue, and obedience. To the empire, a girl's future as a wife, mother, or scholar's daughter was irrelevant. Once chosen, she vanished into the Forbidden City forever. Her name might survive in family memory for a time, but her body and soul belonged now to the Dragon Throne. Imagine such a girl, born in a rural village, her world no bigger than a cluster of fields and a small temple. She has never traveled beyond a few miles, never seen walls taller than her father's house, never worn silk finer than her wedding dowry chest. Then one morning, she is summoned to the capital. Suddenly, she is walking beneath gates taller than anything she has ever dreamed, past courtyards so vast they seem like endless plains of stone. She hears languages and dialects she cannot understand, the rustle of thousands of silk robes, the muffled sobs of others who have been taken, just like her. The palace itself was designed not as a home, but as a fortress of control. The outer court belonged to officials, generals, and the emperor's ministers. The inner court, the world of women, was cut off entirely. No woman could leave without permission. They were sealed behind walls, guarded not just by soldiers but by rituals, rules, and endless surveillance. Even the layout of the architecture funneled their lives inward, layer upon layer of gates and courtyards that led deeper and deeper into confinement. Within this labyrinth, hierarchy determined survival. At the pinnacle stood the empress, the emperor's sole official wife, revered as the mother of the world. Beneath her were consorts of varying ranks, each granted titles like noble lady or pure concubine, titles that promised honor but hid a harsher truth. Their worth was measured entirely by how useful they were to the emperor's legacy. A single misstep could erase years of carefully maintained favor. To the outside world, these women might have been envied, imagined as living in luxury among jade ornaments and flowing robes. Yet behind the walls, their existence was closer to imprisonment. Every gesture, every word, every friendship was monitored. Their bodies were inspected, their movements restricted, their destinies bound to the whim of one man. And yet, beneath this crushing machinery of control, sparks of resistance endured. That night in 1542, when 16 women conspired to end the emperor's life, was not born of sudden madness. It was the culmination of years of abuse and despair. Their hands, trembling in the dark, were guided not only by desperation but by something stronger, the faint, almost impossible dream of freedom. What drove them to this point? To answer, we must look deeper into the system itself, the men who guarded it, the rituals that bound it, and the ways in which human beings were remade into tools of power. For within the Forbidden City, cruelty was not random. It was designed, perfected, and sustained for centuries. In the Forbidden City, the presence of men was nearly erased. No father, no brother, no husband was permitted to enter the women's quarters. Only one kind of man moved freely among them, the eunuch. Their shuffling steps echoed through every courtyard. Their voices called names at dawn. Their eyes followed every concubine from chamber to chamber. They were the empire's chosen guardians, men who had been unmade to ensure that the emperor's bloodline remained pure. The official story was simple. Eunuchs could be trusted because they could not father children, but the truth was more brutal. Most had not chosen this fate. Many were boys, some only 8 years old, taken from peasant families, others sold by desperate parents who could not afford to keep them. The procedure was as cruel as it was final. Unlike in some cultures where castration meant only the removal of the testes, in China the entire organ was cut away, penis, scrotum, everything. The boys were held down while a knife reshaped their future in one stroke. Blood loss was immense. Infection was common. Less than 2/3 survived. Picture such a boy. He has been playing in the courtyard hours before, his head still shaved in the style of children. Suddenly he is dragged into a room that reeks of urine and smoke. A cloth is shoved between his teeth to stifle his screams. When the knife descends, his childhood ends. If he survives, he wakes weak, trembling, and forever changed. He will spend the rest of his life in the palace, neither fully man nor woman, existing only to serve the very system that destroyed him. The consequences lingered in every step. Many eunuchs suffered incontinence, a smell that clung to their robes and marked them even in the opulence of the Forbidden City. Court officials despised them as half-men, yet feared their power. For while concubines lived and died at the whim of the emperor, eunuchs learned to wield influence like a weapon. They were the invisible hands that managed everything from food supply to imperial decrees. And within the harem itself, their authority was absolute. It was the eunuchs who inspected concubines before they were allowed near the emperor. They oversaw baths, checked for signs of illness, and documented every encounter. In the Ming dynasty, the bureaucracy of intimacy reached surreal precision. Secretaries recorded the emperor's sex life with brushes dipped in vermilion ink. Every visit, every night spent with a different woman, was logged like an imperial tax record. A concubine's most private moment could be reduced to a line of calligraphy, stored forever in the archives. The calendar itself became a tool of control. While ordinary people marked seasons of harvest or festivals, the court calendar marked which concubine was to be presented to the emperor on which night. It was believed that the emperor's sexual life was tied directly to the health of the empire. Even passion was transformed into a duty of state, regimented and stripped of humanity. Imagine being one of those women, summoned not because of affection, but because a schedule decreed it. You have been bathed, your body examined by physicians who speak of you in clinical detachment. Then, carried sometimes literally if your bound feet make walking impossible into the emperor's chamber. You are an offering, a vessel. Afterward, whether the encounter lasts moments or hours, your name is brushed into a register and the door closes behind you. No tenderness remains, only ink on paper. For the eunuchs, power came not from desire but from control. They dictated when a woman ate, when she slept, when she could leave her chamber. They carried messages, but also secrets, rumors of favor, whispers of disgrace. Some became loyal servants, others exploited their position to enrich themselves or to manipulate palace politics. A single word from a eunuch could elevate a concubine into the emperor's favor or condemn her to lifelong obscurity. Yet even they were not free. Though they commanded thousands of women, they themselves were prisoners of a different kind. They had no families, no descendants, no identity beyond the walls of the palace. Their loyalty was bought not with honor, but with mutilation. Their existence was the empire's cruel paradox, men destroyed in order to guard women who themselves were imprisoned. Together, eunuchs and concubines formed a world entirely cut off from the rest of China, a strange society of silence, ritual, and fear. Every gesture was watched. Every word could be reported. Privacy ceased to exist. In such a world, even the smallest act of rebellion, an unsanctioned friendship, a forbidden glance, A whispered secret was dangerous. This was no ordinary household. It was a machine, finely tuned to extract obedience, to regulate desire, and to transform human beings into instruments of imperial power. Within that machine, the emperor alone stood as master. But for those beneath him, whether concubine or eunuch, survival meant surrendering not only freedom, but also the most intimate parts of body and soul. Before a girl ever set foot inside the Forbidden City, her body was often already broken for the sake of beauty and control. For centuries, Chinese society celebrated the lotus foot, tiny, arched feet, bound so tightly that they could fit into shoes no longer than 4 inches. This practice, romanticized in poetry and art, was in truth a lifelong mutilation, a way of ensuring that women were both desirable and dependent. The process began when a girl was no older than 4 or 5. Her bones were still soft, pliable, perfect for reshaping. A mother, or sometimes an older female relative, would soak the child's feet in hot water mixed with herbs. Then the real agony began. The arch of the foot was deliberately broken, the toes bent under and pressed into the sole, the foot folded in half and bound tightly with long strips of cloth. The bindings cut off circulation, sometimes leading to infection so severe that toes rotted and fell away. Mothers listened to the muffled cries of their daughters for nights on end, knowing that to relent would be to doom the child to a future without marriage or status. Imagine that scene. A little girl screaming, clutching at her mother's sleeves, unable to understand why the person meant to protect her was the very one causing her pain. The smell of blood and decay hung in the air as the bindings tightened, day after day, month after month, until walking became a lifelong agony. The results, however, were considered beautiful. A successful lotus foot was supposed to resemble a delicate flower bud, the ideal symbol of refinement and femininity. Yet behind this symbol lay a cruel truth. Bound feet crippled women. They could no longer run. They could barely walk more than a few steps without assistance. In the palace, this helplessness became another form of imprisonment. A concubine with bound feet could not escape, even if by some miracle she slipped past the guards and gates. She would be caught within hours, stumbling in pain through streets she could barely navigate. In the Ming and Qing harems, many concubines were literally carried into the emperor's chambers by eunuchs. Naked, unable to walk with dignity, they were presented like offerings. Their immobility was not a flaw but a feature of the system, proof that they were powerless, that their bodies belonged entirely to the court. Poets of the time compared lotus feet to golden lotuses or fragrant petals, romanticizing what was in truth a cycle of torture passed from mother to daughter. The cruelest irony was that the women who performed the binding were often victims themselves. They believed they were securing their daughters' futures, even as they inflicted the same suffering they had endured. Within the harem walls, foot binding reinforced the hierarchy of obedience. Every step a concubine took was a reminder of her pain, a lesson written into her bones. You exist to endure, to obey, to be admired from a distance, but never free. The beauty praised by society was built upon the silence of countless girls whose cries were swallowed by layers of cloth. And yet, some women found ways to reclaim fragments of agency. They embroidered their tiny shoes with elaborate designs, turning objects of pain into canvases of artistry. They exchanged whispered stories of childhood fields, of climbing hills before their feet were broken, holding on to memories of freedom long after it was denied them. These quiet acts of memory and creation were small, but they were resistance nonetheless. Still, the larger truth remained. The practice of foot binding was not merely a cultural ideal, it was a tool of control, ensuring that women could not run from the roles assigned to them. In the Imperial Harem, where escape was already impossible, foot binding made sure that even the thought of resistance was bound tightly, folded under, and crushed into silence. If the Forbidden City was a gilded cage, then under Emperor Jiajing, it became a laboratory of nightmares. His reign from 1521 to 1567 is remembered not only for political withdrawal, but for an obsession so grotesque it blurred the line between superstition and cruelty, the pursuit of immortality through blood. According to court records and later chronicles, Jiajing believed that the secret to eternal life could be found in the menstrual blood of virgins. Mixed into an alchemical compound known as red lead, this essence was thought to preserve his vitality, to keep the mandate of heaven burning in his veins. To gather this substance, hundreds of girls were taken into the palace not as consorts, not even as servants, but as vessels. The chosen were heartbreakingly young. Many were only 12 or 13, their bodies just beginning to change. To preserve the supposed purity of their blood, they were fed a bizarre diet of mulberry leaves and rainwater. Malnourished, fragile, they lived more like experimental animals than human beings. Each dawn, they were forced to collect dew from garden banana leaves, delivering it to the emperor as another elixir for longevity. The palace, with its painted dragons and phoenixes, had become a cage of starvation and ritual. Imagine rows of children, pale and weakened, their small hands clutching jars of dew as offerings. They were watched by eunuchs and physicians, their every movement observed, their natural cycles tracked with clinical detachment. Each month, when their blood arrived, it was harvested with a cold regularity, an intimate part of their being transformed into an ingredient for the emperor's fantasy. Those who sickened under this regime were punished, sometimes beaten, sometimes discarded entirely. Their weakness, though caused by deprivation, was treated as failure. In 1552, Zheng expanded his demands, bringing in more than 200 8-year-old girls. 3 years later, he ordered an additional 150 younger children into the palace, waiting for their bodies to grow until they could provide the blood he craved. 8-year-old children who should have been learning to read, playing with toys, chasing each other in village courtyards, were instead locked behind crimson gates, their futures reduced to a bodily function. While his empire endured famine, rebellion, and corruption, the emperor retreated into isolation in the western quarters of the Forbidden City. He ceased attending court sessions, leaving governance to ministers while he indulged in esoteric rituals, Taoist alchemy, and the gruesome feeding of his immortality cult. Outside the walls, ordinary people suffered hunger and invasion. Inside, the cries of starving children echoed in corridors heavy with incense. This was more than eccentricity. It was systemic horror. The emperor's obsession created a machinery that consumed lives on a staggering scale. The girls' bodies became harvest fields, their blood treated like grain or silk, measured and stored for imperial use. And what of the women who watched this? Concubines, servants, even eunuchs bore witness daily to the suffering of these children. Some tried to shield them, smuggling scraps of food or offering small kindnesses. Others turned away, knowing that sympathy could cost their own lives. But all lived in the shadow of a ruler who had transformed the most intimate aspect of human life into a commodity. It is against this backdrop that the Renyin Plot of 1542 must be understood. The 16 women who dared to strangle the emperor were not simply rebelling against confinement. They had watched children brought into the palace like livestock, had seen them weaken, bleed, and vanish. They had endured the emperor's rituals of cruelty, his neglect of empire, his belief that their very bodies were nothing more than ingredients for his quest to escape mortality. Their desperate attempt to end his life was not a sudden spark of madness. It was the natural consequence of years living inside a nightmare, of seeing no other path to escape. For in Zheng's harem, death was not the greatest horror. Living under his rule was. The night was carefully chosen. In the autumn of 1542, Emperor Zheng retired to the chambers of his favoured concubine, Lady Duan. After their time together, she withdrew, leaving the emperor alone in his vast bedchamber. The hour was late, the halls hushed, only the faint crackle of lanterns and the whisper of silk breaking the silence. In the shadows, 16 palace women exchanged glances. Their plan, months in the making, was about to unfold. They had rehearsed this moment in whispers and gestures. Coded conversations disguised as idle talk of fabrics or poetry, hid discussions of knots and curtain cords. They had practiced tying loops in darkness, measuring whether silk was strong enough to strangle a man. One would hold the emperor's arms, another his legs. One, no older than 14, would slip a ribbon around his neck. The rest would ensure silence and speed. It was a rebellion of desperation, born not of ambition, but of survival. As the emperor drifted into sleep, the women moved. Bare feet glided across the cold marble floor. Curtains swayed slightly as they closed in. Hands trembled but did not stop. A ribbon, pulled from a concubine's own hair, was the first weapon. Perhaps it had been a gift from her mother, the last reminder of a life outside these walls. Now, in the darkest irony, it became a tool to strangle the man who had stolen that life away. The emperor stirred, struggling, gasping as the silk cut against his throat. But the knot was wrong. In their inexperience, the women had tied it loosely, unable to secure it with the practiced brutality of soldiers. Panic spread among them. Some pressed down harder, whispering frantic prayers. Others froze, overcome by terror. At that critical moment, hesitation doomed them. The emperor fought back, his cries muffled but enough to bring attention. One of the conspirators, seized by fear, betrayed the rest. She ran to Empress Fang, reporting the assassination attempt. By the time attendants arrived, the emperor lay unconscious but alive, saved not by his own strength but by the conspirators' lack of skill. The punishment was swift, merciless, and designed as a warning. The 16 women were condemned to Lingqi death by 1,000 cuts. Their families, too, were swept into the sentence. Parents executed, siblings enslaved, entire bloodlines obliterated because of one desperate act. Lingqi was not quick. Executioners, trained in the art of prolonging agony, began with shallow cuts across the limbs. Piece by piece, flesh was sliced away while the victims remained conscious. Sometimes this ritual of cruelty lasted 3 days. Imagine the youngest of the conspirators, no more than 15, strapped to a wooden frame in the public execution ground. She had never been outside the palace walls, never kissed a boy, never held her mother's hand again since being taken at 14. Now her final view of the world was the crowd's silent stares, the gleam of knives, the slow unraveling of her body. The horror did not end with their deaths. Records tell of families punished in brutal fashion, 10 relatives beheaded, 20 enslaved. Parents who had already lost their daughters to the palace lost their own lives as well. Brothers and sisters were sold into servitude, their futures erased. The empire's message was clear. Resistance against the emperor was not just treason, it was annihilation. Yet even in failure, the women's courage endures. They knew what awaited them if caught. They knew that their families would pay the price. And still, they chose to act. Why? Because to live another day under Jiajing's regime amid blood rituals, starvation, and endless surveillance was to suffer a death stretched over years. Lingqi in the execution ground was horrific, but life in the harem had been Lingqi of another kind, 1,000 cuts of the soul. The Renyin Plot remains one of the most haunting episodes in the history of the Forbidden City, not for its failure, nor even for its brutality, but for what it revealed. That even in the most controlled, most silenced environment imaginable, the human will to resist could not be extinguished. These women chose death over obedience, and in doing so, they carved their defiance into history. 3.5 centuries after the Renyin Plot, another woman's story would echo through the walls of the Forbidden City. Her name was Zhen, though history remembers her as Consort Zhen, beloved of the Guangxu Emperor, the penultimate ruler of the Qing dynasty. Where the 16 conspirators had used silk cords to rebel, Zhen wielded something equally dangerous within the harem. Her mind, her curiosity, her refusal to stay silent. Born in 1876, Zhen entered the palace at just 13 years old, accompanied by her elder sister, who was also chosen as a concubine. Unlike many women who faded into obscurity within the labyrinth of the inner court, Zhen's brightness could not be dimmed. She was lively, inquisitive, and fascinated by the world beyond the vermilion walls. While other concubines perfected embroidery or calligraphy, Zhen devoured foreign newspapers, asked questions about Western technology, and discussed reform with anyone willing to listen. It was this spirit that captured the heart of the Guangxu Emperor. He, too, dreamed of reform, of modernizing a dynasty, already teetering under foreign pressure and internal decay. In Zhen, he found not just companionship but encouragement. She urged him to push forward with the 100 Days Reform of 1898, a bold but ill-fated attempt to transform China's political and social structures. For a brief moment, the Forbidden City harbored a rare thing, a union of love and shared vision. But in the harem, being loved could be as perilous as being forgotten. Zhen's influence over the emperor drew the suspicion and wrath of one of the most formidable figures in Chinese history, Empress Dowager Cixi. Once a concubine herself, Cixi had risen to become the de facto ruler of China, wielding power from behind the throne for nearly half a century. To her, Zhen was more than a rival for the emperor's affection, she was a threat to political control. In 1894, Cixi struck. Zhen was accused of meddling in politics, of overstepping her role. The punishment was brutal. Degradation of rank and, according to some accounts, flogging at the hands of eunuchs. Imagine the humiliation: stripped, whipped, reduced from imperial consort to political cautionary tale. Yet Zhen did not retreat into silence. Even after punishment, she continued to encourage Guangxu, her youthful courage refusing to bow before the iron grip of Cixi. The reckoning came in 1900, during the chaos of the Boxer Rebellion. Foreign armies advanced on Beijing, and the imperial court prepared to flee the capital. For Zhen, under house arrest by then, this turmoil became her final trial. According to accounts, Cixi summoned her and spoke with the mask of false mercy. "You are young and beautiful. If you come with us, the foreign soldiers will surely violate you. You know what you must do." The words dripped with feigned concern, but they were a command to die. Zhen refused. She begged instead for Guangxu to stay and negotiate with the foreigners, believing that dialogue could save the empire. Her plea was not only ignored but enraged Cixi. In fury, she ordered that Consort Zhen be thrown into a well behind the Ningrong Palace. Guards obeyed. A young woman of 24, full of life and vision, was dragged to a stone opening barely wide enough for a human body. She was cast into the darkness, her last moments swallowed by cold water and silence. Picture that instant, the rough hands shoving her forward, the scrape of stone against skin as she fell, the shock of icy water rising around her, the last sliver of sky vanishing above. She had dreamed of newspapers, of telegraphs, of a modern China. But her final world was a narrow pit of darkness, her voice extinguished under orders of another woman who had once been as powerless as she. Today, the well remains in the Forbidden City, marked by a simple plaque. Tourists pause briefly, peer into its narrow mouth, snap photographs, and move on. Guides call it a curiosity, a footnote in palace lore. But it is more than that. It is a grave without a tomb, a monument to a woman who refused silence even when it meant death. Consort Zhen's tragedy reveals a chilling truth. Within the harem, love was no shield, intelligence no protection, and courage often a death sentence. Like the 16 women centuries before, she resisted in the only way she could, by daring to live and speak with honesty in a world built on lies and obedience, and like them, she paid with her life. Long before she ordered Consort Zhen's death, Cixi herself had once been just another frightened girl passing through the palace gates. In 1852, she entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine of the Xianfeng Emperor, known formally as Noble Person Yi. At first, she was one among dozens, a teenage girl with little more than her beauty and sharp mind. Like countless others before her, her future seemed destined to be swallowed by obscurity. But fate shifted when she bore the emperor a son, the only son who survived infancy. In the ruthless arithmetic of the harem, this single act transformed her status overnight. She rose from near invisibility to the rank of imperial consort Yi, and, more importantly, became the mother of the heir to the throne. The boy would grow up to be the Tongzhi emperor. In the Forbidden City, bearing a male heir was the surest currency of power, and Cixi had just minted her fortune. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861, China was in crisis. Foreign wars, domestic rebellions, and a weak imperial court left the dynasty staggering. Regents were appointed to guide the young Tongzhi, but Cixi, along with the senior Empress Qian, refused to remain in the shadows. In a bold and dangerous coup known as the Xinyu coup, she orchestrated the arrest and execution of several regents. For the first time in 2,000 years of Chinese history, a woman stepped out of the harem not as victim, but as ruler. From then until her death in 1908, Cixi held the reins of the empire. Ministers bowed before her decrees. Eunuchs whispered her commands. Emperors, including her own son and later her adopted nephew Guangxu, lived under her shadow. She had survived the system by mastering it, wielding cruelty as both shield and sword. Yet her rule was not the dawn of mercy many might have hoped for. Instead of dismantling the structures of oppression that had confined her, Cixi reinforced them. She elevated and dismissed concubines at will, tightened surveillance, and manipulated palace ranks to secure her dominance. In her own family, she showed the same merciless calculation. When the Tongzhi emperor married Empress Alut, Cixi's jealousy of their intimacy grew. Rumors spread that she had their infant son killed to prevent her daughter-in-law from gaining influence. Soon after, Tongzhi himself died suddenly of smallpox or, as some whispered, perhaps under less natural circumstances. Empress Alut, stripped of power and grief-stricken, took her own life by swallowing opium. The girl who had once been powerless had become the very embodiment of the system's cruelty. She had learned its lessons too well. Trust no one. Strike before you are struck. Eliminate threats without hesitation. She understood, better than most, that in the Forbidden City, compassion was weakness, and weakness was death. Cixie's reign illustrates a terrible cycle. Victims, given power, often become the harshest enforcers of the very system that oppressed them. She had suffered as a concubine, but instead of dismantling the cage, she expanded it, ensuring no rival could ever do to her what had once been done to others. Consort Zhen's drowning was not an isolated act of malice. It was the logical conclusion of decades of survival tactics, honed into ruthlessness. To her supporters, Cixi was a political genius who kept the Qing dynasty afloat in turbulent times, navigating wars and rebellions with iron will. To her enemies, she was a tyrant whose obsession with power crippled reform and hastened China's decline. But within the context of the harem, she was something else entirely, the ultimate product of its design, proof that the system could turn even the powerless into architects of oppression. And so, when we think of Cixi, we must hold two truths at once. She was once a girl torn from her family, forced into a gilded prison, her body and future claimed by an emperor, and she was the woman who, decades later, ordered another young concubine cast into a well without hesitation. Victim and perpetrator, survivor and executioner, the dual legacy of a woman shaped entirely by the machinery of the Forbidden City. The tragedies of the Renyin conspirators and Consort Zhen are remembered because they were dramatic, because they ended in blood and rebellion. But their stories were rare exceptions. For every woman who dared to resist or who caught the emperor's eye, there were thousands more whose lives passed unnoticed, swallowed by the immensity of the Imperial Harem. At its height, the harem could contain 9,000, sometimes even 20,000 women. Imagine that number, a city within a city, built entirely of women waiting for a man who might never look upon them. The Forbidden City's endless courtyards became dormitories of longing, competition, and despair. The mathematics alone reveal the futility. If an emperor lived 40 years after ascending the throne and met a different concubine every single night, he would still not exhaust the entire harem. For most, there was no hope of intimacy, no chance to rise. They spent their lives preparing for a summons that never came, their youth dissolving into years of silence. Picture such a woman. Taken at 14, she learns how to walk gracefully, how to bow with perfect precision, how to recite lines of poetry in case she is ever called before the emperor. Every morning, she wakes with the thought, perhaps tonight. She powders her face, adjusts her robes, rehearses her smile. Years pass. The summons never comes. By the time she is 30, her beauty has faded in the eyes of the court. Her hair begins to grey, her hands stiffen with age. She realizes that she will die in the palace, unseen, a prisoner who never even met her captor. The psychological weight was immense. Some concubines endured decades of this waiting. Loneliness bred despair. Palace records speak of women who stopped eating, who talked to invisible companions, who erupted in violence against themselves or others. Madness, in the Forbidden City, was treated not as tragedy but as inconvenience. A broken mind was just another harem casualty, noted in records and swiftly replaced. And yet, even in this sea of despair, women sought ways to endure. They formed fragile friendships, though always shadowed by competition. To care too deeply for another was dangerous. If your friend rose in favor, your own status might fall. If she fell, you could be dragged down with her. Still, human need found cracks in the walls. Concubines whispered poems to each other in dialects from their hometowns. They taught one another lullabies from faraway provinces. They embroidered shoes and robes with secret symbols of their villages, tiny rebellions of memory stitched in silk. These acts of cultural preservation were small flames of resistance against the machinery of erasure. The system tried to strip them of identity, giving them new names, new titles, even new dialects to speak. But in shared songs, in whispered recipes, in coded embroidery, women carried fragments of who they once were. Others resisted more directly. Some concubines deliberately scarred themselves to become less desirable, preferring obscurity to imperial summons. Others spread rumors that destabilized the delicate balance of the court. A few, in moments of utter despair, chose suicide, robbing the emperor of the ownership of their lives. Still, the system endured. It was too vast, too deeply rooted in tradition and power. The majority endured in silence, their names erased, their lives reduced to numbers in court records. For every celebrated consort whose story made it into history, thousands more lived and died without a trace. Today, tourists marvel at the size of the Forbidden City, its hundreds of halls and courtyards. But if you close your eyes, you might imagine the sound it once held, the rustle of 9,000 silk robes at dawn, the murmurs of countless conversations in dialects from across the empire, the sighs of women who would never again see their families, their villages, or the open countryside. Each number was a person, each statistic, a silenced life. The harem system did not merely confine individuals, it consumed generations, transforming daughters into shadows and leaving entire family lines scarred by absence. And within its massive scale lay its greatest cruelty, the ability to make thousands vanish into silence, unnoticed, unremembered, forgotten beneath the golden roofs of the Forbidden City. The harem was not only a prison in life, it could become a tomb in death. When an emperor died, his concubines were often ordered to follow him into the afterlife, willingly or not. In earlier dynasties, this meant ritual suicide. Sometimes it meant burial alive. The Forbidden City, dazzling with red and gold, hid chambers where final commands were delivered. Drink this poison, tighten this noose, step into this tomb. Imagine being a woman who had spent years, perhaps decades, waiting in vain for the emperor's attention. You never bore him children, never earned his favor. Then, at 20 or 25, you receive your first and only direct command, to die for a man who never once spoke your name. The cruelty was not confined to ritual. In the Ming dynasty, Emperor Zhengde collected so many concubines that he could not feed them all. Records describe women starving within the palace walls, wasting away while the emperor disguised himself as a commoner and slipped into Beijing's brothels for amusement. The harem overflowed with silk and jewels, yet inside its chambers women died of hunger. To him, they were not human beings but ornaments, and ornaments could be discarded when too numerous. Later emperors, like Jiajing, diverted the empire's resources not to governance but to their own obsessions, alchemy, blood rituals, endless expansion of harems. While peasants starved in the countryside, palace kitchens strained to feed thousands of women whose sole purpose was to wait. The empire itself became unbalanced, drained by the weight of indulgence. For the women inside, the knowledge of disposability was constant. A single cough, a wrinkle, a misstep could mark the end of favor. Some were quietly executed for imagined crimes, others were simply abandoned, left to fade into obscurity until death came naturally or unnaturally. Even survival beyond an emperor's death was no guarantee. Concubines of lower rank were often expelled or forced into monastic life, living as nuns under strict vows. To the court, their usefulness ended with the emperor's last breath. This cycle of cruelty extended beyond palace walls. The normalization of violence within the harem trickled into society. If emperors treated women as disposable, why wouldn't officials, soldiers, or merchants do the same? The court's casual brutality sanctioned cruelty at every level of Chinese life, embedding patterns of subjugation that lasted centuries. And yet, there was always a human face behind the statistics. Picture a girl of 15, taken from her family in Guangdong, renamed, reborn as a concubine. She waits in silence for years, never summoned. One morning, she hears the emperor is dead. Guards arrive at her chamber. She is told she must prepare to die. She is given silk cords or a cup of poison. Perhaps she resists, pleading that she never once lay with him, that she deserves to live. Her words mean nothing. By nightfall, her body is cold, one among dozens sacrificed to follow a man she never knew. The cruelty of the harem lay not only in its confinement, but in its absolute theft of choice. Life and death alike were dictated by imperial decree. Women entered unwillingly, endured powerlessly, and often perished anonymously. Even in death, they were not allowed to belong to themselves. The Forbidden City, in all its grandeur, became a mausoleum for countless unnamed women, buried in tombs, starved in chambers, drowned in wells, forgotten by history. Their lives were consumed twice over, once by the emperor's neglect, and again by society's silence. Today, the Forbidden City stands as one of the world's great monuments. Its walls stretch endlessly, its golden roofs shine like fire beneath the Beijing sky, and millions of tourists pass through its gates each year. They marvel at the architecture, at the dragon motifs and painted beams, at the halls named for harmony and longevity. But the true cost of this beauty often goes unspoken. Behind every hall, every courtyard, lie the stories of women whose lives were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of imperial glory. In popular culture, the harem has been remade into romance. Television dramas portray clever concubines who win the emperor's love with wit and beauty. Novels imagine palace intrigues as thrilling competitions, where the greatest danger is jealousy, and the greatest reward is affection. Costumes shimmer on screen, and audiences sigh at the imagined luxury of palace life. But such stories are illusions. They erase the hunger, the mutilation, the blood rituals, the drownings, the suicides. They erase the silence of thousands who lived and died without ever being seen. Even historical records are complicit. Written mostly by men, they emphasize emperors' achievements, ministers' wisdom, dynasties' fates. The women of the harem are reduced to names on lists, or not named at all. Their pain is hidden between the lines of imperial decrees, their deaths summarized in phrases like, "followed the emperor in death," or "dismissed from service." Entire lives are lost in footnotes. And yet, fragments remain. A court record describing an execution, a poem secretly written by a concubine, a foreign visitor's diary noting the strange silence of palace women. These scraps, though incomplete, form a picture of systematic erasure, of voices cut short, of humanity deliberately buried. The system survived for more than 2,000 years, not simply because of emperors, but because society accepted it. Parents surrendered their daughters, believing it an honor. Officials enforced the selections. Eunuchs executed the rules. Merchants supplied silks and perfumes. Artists painted flattering portraits that masked horror as beauty. Everyone participated, convincing themselves that it was tradition, necessity, or even destiny. That is how oppression endures, not through a single tyrant, but through the quiet cooperation of millions who choose not to see. And yet, resistance flickered even in the darkest corners. 16 women who risked death by 1,000 cuts to strangle Emperor Jiajing. Consort Zhen, who spoke of reform and refused to kill herself even when ordered by CIXI. Countless unnamed women who scarred their faces to avoid notice, who whispered songs from their villages, who preserved scraps of dignity in a system designed to erase them. These acts may not have toppled dynasties, but they proved something vital, that even within complete control, the human spirit cannot be wholly crushed. The harem ended with the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, but its echoes remain. In modern times, women are no longer locked behind palace gates, yet systems of exploitation endure in new forms. Human trafficking, workplace harassment, cultures that value women only by their appearance or their obedience, all are descendants of the same patterns of control. The structures change, but the logic remains. Isolate, surveil, devalue, and erase. To walk through the Forbidden City today is to walk among ghosts. The well where Consort Zhen drowned is still there, covered by a stone slab and a modest plaque. Tourists stop for photographs, remarking on how small the opening is, then move on. Few pause to imagine what it was like for a 24-year-old woman to fall into that darkness, her last breath silenced by water and stone. Few imagine the thousands of nameless concubines who lived their entire lives in rooms that still stand, waiting for a call that never came. The darkest secret of the Chinese Imperial Harem is not a single act of cruelty. It is the way horror was made normal, the way suffering was disguised as beauty, the way entire generations of women were erased without outrage. That is the legacy we must confront, not just the grandeur of palaces, but the silence of those who once filled them. To remember them is to resist forgetting. To tell their stories truthfully, without romance, is to honor their courage. Every time we speak of the Renyin conspirators, their doomed rebellion becomes a spark that still burns. Every time we recall Consort Zhen, her voice rises once more from the well. These women could not escape the Forbidden City in life, but in memory, they can. Their defiance endures not in victory, but in the refusal to let silence bury them completely. The walls of the Forbidden City still stand, red and gold, glowing under the Beijing Sunday. But within those walls, we must learn to see more than architecture. We must see the women whose lives were taken to sustain an empire. Their courage, their suffering, their resistance. They are the truest legacy of the harem, and they deserve never to be forgotten.